Hi everyone. In this video, I'm going to give you some tips and tricks for the task editor. There are some pretty common mistakes that are made, so hopefully this video gives you a nice overview of the things to do and not to do. So we'll go kind of in a random order here. The first thing I want to show you is a fairly decent example of using the factor tree in the task editor. So if you haven't watched the overview of the task editor video yet, it is linked here. Definitely go watch that first and then come back to this one. Okay, so let's talk about the factor tree. There are several parts to the factor tree, the first being trial groups. And trial groups are for a task that is its own kind of entity. So each trial group is going to have factors and levels. Factors are going to be your independent variables, and levels are the levels of the independent variable. So the first thing that I'm varying in this study is which animal is on the screen. And then the second thing that I'm varying is the position of the animal on the screen. Okay, so if I look here, this is an example from the task editor. I think this is from the factor tree video actually. And what this is showing is that there is one animal on the screen and one flower. And so the participant has to choose correctly the pet or the animal. But what I've done here is this is a trial group in which there are conditions. So your factors and the levels of your factors are going to cross each other and become conditions. So I have dog on the left, dog on the right, cat on the left, and cat on the right. Okay, so those are my conditions. The trick here is that trial groups are their own entity, like I said. What you don't want to do is copy your trial group several times over and use that as your trials. As you can see, I already have set here 4 trials per condition. What I don't want to do is keep clicking copy on this trial group and create a bunch of trial groups, because what that's going to do is it's actually going to intermix my trials. So I'll show you an example here. This is an example of correctly copying a trial group, and I'll explain why in a second. But what happens is now I have even more trials that are going to get crossed into the other trial. So they're all going to show up in a random order. And the reason that this is a good example of copying this trial group is because it is the exact same task, but I have changed one tiny aspect and I want them to be randomly interleaved, essentially. So what I've done here is instead of clicking on a picture of an animal, they're going to click on the text word of the animal. Okay, so the same study design, the same idea of, dog left, dog right, cat left, cat right, except instead of an image, it's a word. So it wouldn't make sense for me to create an entirely different task for these two because I do want them to be randomly shuffled into each other. So that's why I have a different trial group. But, it's essentially the same task. I'm just showing them a word instead of an image. Okay, so in this case, if I wanted to have, say, 100 trials, I wouldn't keep copying this trial group. I would just change the number of trials down here. Okay, so that's a common mistake, and we'll come back to this example in a bit. Probably the most common thing that we see in a misuse of the task editor is using frames as trials, okay? So all I've done is I've just put a text box on this frame to kind of illustrate the example here. But what we see very often is people basically copy the same frame over and over again just to change one small aspect. So, you keep clicking copy, and I say, okay, for this trial, I want to show this word. So I'm just going to change it to be this word. And what that does is it kind of clogs up the study. What we would prefer, strongly prefer that you do, is actually edit the number of trials over here. Okay? Because frames are sort of like, think of the method section of a poster. Okay? Think about it that way. So in the method section, typically you have different squares representing the different stages of a trial in your study. So the first one maybe is a fixation cross, and then you have a stimulus, and then you have a question, and then you have feedback, or something to that effect. That's the same thing we're doing here. So instead of having a million frames, what we want to do is change the number of trials, or presentations of this sequence of frames. So now I have 5 trials, and in each of those trials, they're going to see all 5 of these frames. So if I've done this correctly, we're going to do a fixation cross, and then we're going to say, this is my stimulus. And then we'll say, this is a question about the stimulus. And then this is the feedback of the correctness of the answer to the question. And then maybe this is like a pause right here. Okay? So hopefully that makes more sense. That's the most common mistake we see. That's just going to clog up the study. And then if you need to go back and change something later, you're going to be scrolling through hundreds of frames instead of just 3 or 4. And then it changes itself for all of the trials. Okay? Next example is in a questionnaire doing the same thing, having tons and tons of sheets of a questionnaire, each of which only has one question on it. So quick review here, and I'll link the video in the description. Page frames are different than canvas frames. So typically you don't have more than one trial if you're doing a questionnaire task, which is what I'm doing here. Typically you'll just have a few page frames, each of which has several questions on it. So something we definitely don't want to do would be to have, 5, 6, 7 page frames, each of which only has one question, and a whole bunch of repeat trials of these 6 questions. So what we would recommend is adding all of your questions, or at least a good number of them, to the same page frame and only use as many as necessary. So don't create 5 or 6 page frames of a questionnaire that each only have one question. That's just going to clog up the system, and then you're going to need to go through and program events to get your participant through all of these sheets of a book. That's not what we're trying to do here. So just a quick little example for page frames. And then to kind of wrap up, I wanted to show you that we have essentially 2 different ways to utilize the task editor. And so we'll jump back to this example. The first way to use the task editor is to heavily rely on this factor tree. So this is going to be the more visual way. It's very not as intuitive, but once you get the hang of the factor tree and the trials and conditions window, it does make a lot of sense, because once you've set up your variables as factors and levels, everything crosses and randomizes, and it's basically set up for you. So that's the first way, is to kind of program it yourself using this factor tree. And then coming in here, and let's say I'm using images as an example, coming in here, clicking that file icon, and loading all of the images that you want from your account. So let's just select a bunch of images here. And then you can use the little spreadsheet icon at the bottom. You can assign them all to trials like this. Okay, and now I have a whole bunch of images loaded in here. It'll take a second to load because my computer's slow. So essentially that's the first way to use the task editor, is relying on the factor tree, loading everything in yourself. The second way to use the task editor, which is equally as good, we recommend both, is to rely more so on arrays. So this is just an example frame pulled from a different study. But essentially what I've done is I've pulled in this event that heavily relies on arrays. So I'm using the event system on frame start to pull in all of my stimuli from an array that I have built. So I've got drawing a random number, and then that number is going to be used to randomly pull a file from an array, and then that's the image that's going to be shown. So the short version here is that you can either do lots of things in the factor tree and kind of manually add your stimuli, or you can just create a bunch of variables that hold all of your stimuli like this. This is an example of an image array. and then rely on the event system to structure the study for you. I will add some more things in the description of this video, but essentially that is our best practices for the task editor. I hope this video was helpful.